now to our next amazing speaker. I mean, it is incredible the depth of talent we've got today from our expert speakers, and it's Professor Jennifer Davidson, who you'll all know, but focusing on child-friendly justice pathways from an international perspective. And you'll all know Professor Davidson very well. She's done incredible work internationally and within Scotland. She really is a leading light. She's a professor of practice and executive director for the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures at the University of Strathclyde. And we all know their incredible work that they've done to ensure that children can reach their full potential. And this builds on her work as the founding director of Celsus, and she's worked across a number of international and domestic projects, and she's been such a great human rights leader for us all, but particularly embedding the UN Sustainable Goals into the work that we do. And you'll all know that Scotland has made a strong, in fact, one of the first commitments to the SDGs, largely down to Jennifer's fantastic work. And so her leadership has been immense, and particularly the focus that we have at the moment on the UN guidelines for alternative care of children and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child commitment to focus more on some of that work is really important to us all. And so I will pass to you now, Professor Davidson.
That's great, thank you. That's cringeworthy to hear that introduction, but thank you. I am really just so delighted to be with you here. And before I jump in, I'm going to do my very best to properly share my presentation. Let me see. And I'm going to start from the beginning. And I'm going to look to someone. I'm going to listen for someone to tell me that they can see
good,
this.
Jennifer, it's all good.
Perfect. Good. That is a good voice to hear. Thanks, Claire. So I want to just, I'm like Anthony, I wanted to start by saying like all of you, I was so blown away by Hannah's presentation, and just the reminder just brings us right down to the very core of why we do this work. And, you know, that we cannot for a moment be complacent. I loved the thing that she said at the very end about, you know, just sort of with a plea actually of, that Hannah, if you're still on the conference, just thank you so much. But I think your plea about that a person can flourish when they get that individualized attention, you know, it's such a simple, you know, simple statement, but so important for us to hold on to, that, you know, that we've got every child we're responsible for in Scotland to make sure they get the individualized attention, and nothing less will do, really, I think, for all of us. So I wanted to start by saying how much I appreciated hearing from Hannah and CYCJ. Yet again, you're doing a stellar job of bringing people who really bring us right to the core of what's most important as we're gathering together. So I feel really honored to be invited to be speaking here today, and a little daunted. So I think, you know, you all will know youth justice and criminal justice and the world of justice for children in Scotland so well. And so I hope that my contribution today will help to maybe add something to our collective understanding, and help perhaps to drive forward our vision together a bit further. And I recognize, you know, the many of you who are here who've dedicated, like I have, and so many of others have dedicated our whole lives to making the world better, particularly for children who face the greatest adversities. And I think we're really driven to do our work on behalf of those children whose rights are most likely to be violated. And so we really celebrate the moment that we have in Scotland, I think, at the moment with the CRC. So today I've been invited to bring an international perspective to our conference. And for me, I just wanted to reflect what that means for me is really learning from wider horizons and being exposed to sometimes new ideas. And sometimes it's just confirmatory that we're on the right track. And sometimes it's something that's quite new, or a different angle on some of the problems we've been wrestling with for a long time. And I think the international is important because every society is dealing with what to do with young people who might break a rule. Do you know, every society is dealing with a child whose parents might not be able to care for them. Do you know, these are global challenges, and we wrestle with them in our own country contexts, but they are common agendas we can learn from. And I think it also offers us a bit of a common language. So I think the CRC, for example, is a great example of how that CRC incorporation now is giving us all a language of ways of describing what's happened to Hannah, for example, and others about breaches of their rights. I mean, that's a very powerful common language, and it gives teeth because there's a legislation that sits around it. So I think internationally, we can then benchmark ourselves against other places that have incorporated the CRC and what they're doing in relation to them, in relation to children. And hopefully our learning here in Scotland can also benefit others around the world, as it already does. But fundamentally, I feel I need to also say that an international perspective is only as useful as it makes an impact on children's day-to-day lives where we are. And so I don't want to imply for a moment that there's that somehow that something happening out there internationally has relevance. It only has relevance if it's facilitated by all of us here today and all of you in your daily work. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to play around with this idea of child-friendly justice pathways, probably in a completely imperfect way about talking about pathways. And it might even be a metaphor of pathways that will become cringeworthy by the end of this session. But I'm going to talk about what's the context of the terrain that we're looking at in terms of the child-friendly justice pathways we strive for. How wide is that justice, and how are we defining justice? And what's the distance we have to travel? And ultimately, what are the tools that we have, and what's the hope that we bring? So I think in many ways, I'm echoing in perhaps slightly different ways much of what we heard from Jules and from Anthony. So this will be a fun ride. The first, just to think about pathways with you for a moment, I should have really not showed you these pictures first, I suppose, but I want you to just sort of not look at these pictures and imagine a pathway. I quite like this term pathway because it gives us something to grasp. It gives us a metaphor to sort of play around with. And Anthony, you were saying earlier about that we struggle with definitions. What is participation? What is youth justice? So I think I agree with you that, boy, it's a slippery term, and I'm not sure we all understand that. Nor am I going to give you the answers. I just want to let you know. And Jules was talking about children's place not being in the adult courts. So I think when we think about pathways, what do you envision in terms of a child-friendly justice pathway? Is there sort of a metaphor you can think of? And more importantly, probably the question is, where's it going? What's its purpose? And how do we ensure that whatever child-friendly justice pathways we're striving to create and fine-tune in Scotland is a form which follows the function or its purpose that we're looking for? So for some pathways, for some children, I think the pathways are, children are temporarily on a path because there's a contested custody battle, perhaps, between their parents in the midst of a difficult divorce. Perhaps they're temporarily in court in relation to redress around rights breaches. For others, and for the children I think we all are most concerned about here, who are facing the greatest adversities, who face huge amounts of barriers in their lives, they've found themselves on a path as it leads them perhaps towards detention, perhaps towards care proceedings. But really though, I suppose I want to ask ourselves, do children even belong on this path? There needs to be a safe place to realize their rights, of course. But I sort of have this image for myself of maybe there's just a path over there, but actually where children are is in a big green park place or a big, play area to play in. So my question, I guess, is for us is how close do we want this pathway? Where does it locate? And where do we want it located? And I think justice, you as justice actors, can play a real role, of course, in preventing children needing this pathway at all. But there are other actors that are working to reduce inequalities and who can achieve other forms of economic and social justice. And this would enable fewer children to even notice that there is a pathway. And I think that's probably what I would hope for most of all. So let's start with the terrain that's sort of surrounding. Here I've got a picture of the terrain being a little suburban play area, limited by my Google searches for stock images. I apologize. But if we think about the international terrain in which we're thinking about child-friendly justice pathways, first of all, let me just say, you may or may not know, children are roughly 1 in 3 people around the world. When they grow up like us, they're going to become the other 2/3 of the population. And these children have a right to grow up in safe, nurturing, sufficient environments. But children are distinct and they have specific needs and rights and capacities. And so we need to respond differently in light of that distinctiveness. And so the pathway needs to take account of those specific needs, the evolving capacity, etc. And I think we're slowly coming around to that globally. So, slowly, it seems. The CRC, as people have said, it was sort of 89 that it was declared, 32 years ago. Took 10 years of writing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And not long after that, about 12 years later, the UN Millennium Development Goals came into play. So these are from 2000 to 2015. And the MDGs, as they were called, didn't name children explicitly, and they were mainly for developing countries. These are goals, global goals that are agreed unanimously by all UN member states. The value of them, I would say, is that they help to focus on donors in international key areas for change. For example, there had been before in relation to extreme poverty. And so these goals also come with indicators that help us to focus on how are we doing. And the focus for the MDGs was about improving the average. So the SDGs, however, the SDGs came into agreement and sort of launched in 2015. So this is for the next 15 years. So we are in the last decade, less than that, of the SDGs. And I think probably a couple of things just to say about that is that children are named explicitly in the SDGs. That's really important because it gives us leverage as advocates. The second thing to say is that the SDGs are for all countries. They're not just for developing countries. The third thing to say is that it's not about changing the median. It's not like taking the average and just shifting it and making everything on average get better, because we know those who are left behind just continue to be left behind. And so the things that it's inspired me about the SDGs is that it's focusing specifically on leaving, not just leaving no one behind. Here two quotes from some SDG older and newer content, but it's not just leaving no one behind, but it's actually reaching the furthest behind first. And I just have to say that, I think many of us, our whole lives have been about recognizing those who are most marginalized, the injustices they face, and trying to address that. So for me, the SDGs offer some amount of hope, just because the language is changing, not because I think SDGs in any way on their own can do anything of real power, but they do have an important narrative that the countries have signed up to. So I want to just focus on SDG 16 for a minute, because that's where justice comes in. So this is about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels in order for us to be able to work together well. And so the first thing to say about the SDG 16 is that they're the goals here on the left, and on the right, I'm going to just pop up three of the indicators. And I want to just spend a bit of time looking at this for a moment. So the first thing to say is the second is 16.3. We're looking here at ensuring equal access to justice for all. Globally, we've been seeing the global study on children deprived of liberty, for example, that you may have heard Professor Manfred Nowak, who spoke at the Kilbrandon Lecture in 2020. It's online if you're interested in watching it or reading it. This was a global study on children deprived of liberty. It was a comprehensive study, large team of experts, but several hundred children were interviewed, and they explored 6 themes around children who were deprived of liberty. So they looked at juvenile justice, they looked at children who are detained with their primary caregivers, children who are detained for migration reasons, residential childcare institutions, children who are detained because of armed conflict, and those who are detained for national security grounds. And what they found was there are over 7 million children who are deprived of liberty globally. And I think one of the things that's really been useful in hearing about this, because it's quite for some of us that's a shocking number, for others it's means nothing because it's the number, and it's not sort of unpacked in terms of the wider concept. These are children who are deprived of liberty for the most part, with absolutely no access to any kind of justice to get out of that deprivation of their liberty. The way in which that's been framed quite often has been calling this structural violence, and I want to just hold on to that concept, because no one's arguing, I think, in Scotland that violence is something we want to prevent. I mean, that's quite, we would all agree that's an important thing. But to name deprivation of liberty as a structural violence, I think is a really valuable and powerful way of reminding ourselves of what we are doing as people in charge of the systems and people working in the systems and those who are determining the laws that shape those systems, that there's a structural violence that underpins the kinds of things we're seeing in Scotland in relation to children employment, for example, among other things. The other thing to say about detention is over the course of COVID, there was a great campaign to accelerate the release of children from detention to protect children from COVID. And so while I didn't see a lot of that going on here in Scotland, I'm afraid to say, it did lead to emergency release and reintegration of hundreds of children worldwide. It boosted concrete child justice sector reform. And there has subsequently been very clear messages at the UN level, the Crime Congress and other places, that that is a growing message, which is if we can release children from detention during COVID, we don't need to have children in detention at all. And so I think it's offered a moment of shifting our perceptions of what's possible, which has been really important to hold on to. The last thing to say on this page is just to say that an element about 16.7, which is about participatory decision making that is meaningful. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking this, but I do want to just flag that what we've just heard from Hannah has been such an important message, and it's an example of one of many different examples of how we are thinking carefully about supporting voices and participation of people who are, in order to encourage not just their voice, but ultimately to have an impact in decision making and how that changes. And I think we have some great examples in Scotland of that, not least with the promise. Emerging from this SDG and the number of targets and indicators within that is a partnership called the Pathfinders for Justice, which I'm a part of. And they are really forging ahead with a global movement in relation to justice that is focused very much on people-centered justice. So we're getting away from the systems, we're getting away from the laws, and we're starting with what does justice feel like for the people who are experiencing it or who need it? And this requires us to be seeing justice and the rule of law as underpinning all of our national as well as local efforts to realize people's full range of rights. And so while the SDG agenda pledges to leave no one behind, I think it's pretty clear that even with people-centered justice, we still have a long way to go in terms of reaching those who are the farthest behind, and particularly children who are the farthest behind. So these pathways can't be just people-centered, though that would be great, because children are distinct from adults, as we know so well. And so that's the sort of international terrain that I wanted to gallop over, if you will. And what does that say about our pathways? Maybe I don't think we want to ever lose sight of the fact that children are interdependent in their context of their families and communities around them. However, nevertheless, this is a justice pathway, I think, that will only be sufficient and will only be child friendly if it's rights respecting, if it's focusing on those children who are most left behind, if it's people-centered, and if it's child-centered, and that is that it's theirs and that they don't share it with adults. They don't have to compromise in order to attend to the needs of the adults that are also on this pathway with them. I want to just shift now to thinking about how wide is justice. So we've talked about the terrain. Now let's talk about the width of this pathway. And turning to some really sobering realities that are very close to home, I think, for many of us. So this Pathfinders quote that I have here about a global movement for justice makes you really think about what do we mean by justice? And Anthony really beautifully sort of made reference throughout his presentation to the sort of social determinants of people's outcomes, of their health, of their well-being, and clearly that's forming some element of our understanding about justice. So criminal justice, for example, might be looking at the age of criminal responsibility. We're looking at child witnesses, the Barnahus model. Civil justice is looking at child protection, care proceedings, family custody disputes. I just want to think about administrative justice with us for a few minutes. That's really looking more about access to services, maybe immigration decisions. There will be others, and others of you who are legal experts will be able to tell me if I've got some of the categories wrong, or if, you know, there are many others that you encounter on a day-to-day basis in your practice. And I think we are already in Scotland, compared to the rest of the world, well ahead in terms of understanding these full range of justice systems and the importance of a whole system approach. Having said that, unlike I suppose, while we might have had a whole system approach and we understand some of the social determinants of justice outcomes, I want to talk about someone whose name you may not know. So I'm going to bring into the room now the memories of Linda Allen, of William Lindsay, and of Brian Ross, to name a few. And I want to just remind ourselves of tragedies that we know of from a distance, or for some. A name you will, Smith. At least you won't know her. Canadians will know her. And I want to pay tribute to my colleague Erin Lux at Strathclyde, who's a PhD student whose outrage about the injustices Ashley faced has driven her to do the work that she's doing at the moment. And I want to tell you about Ashley. So, and I'm not going to tell you a lot of the details, because actually we would just have to stop, and I wouldn't be able to go through the presentation. So just the high level information is that Ashley was a teenager when she died by suicide in a Canadian adult women's correctional facility. She was over 1,000 miles from her home, as far as here to Paris. The systemic, institutionalized, inhumane treatment that she experienced is a level of shocking action that is quite striking. Ashley was put in I won't even go into the details about the end of her life, but leading up to that, I'd like to say that Ashley was put in solitary confinement after disruptive behavior on her first day, and her initial 1-month sentence lasted almost 4 years, entirely in isolation, until her death in 2007. She was moved 17 times between 9 institutions in 5 provinces over 11 months. And it then took a further 6 years for a coroner's jury to return a verdict of homicide. So I'm not going to revisit the shocking actions towards Ashley in the criminal justice system here, other than to say 2 things. The first is that, of course, we know that injustices are happening at the hands of justice towards children, at the hands of justice systems all over the world. And also that there are people in organizations globally working towards changing these things, like you, like CYCJ, and many others, and change is clearly happening. The second thing I want to draw our attention to is to say that Ashley's treatment by the justice system was it was utterly inhumane and begs so many questions, but Ashley's earlier life as well tells an important story of dimensions of injustice I'd like us to consider as a way for us to think about how widely we define and call out injustice. I'm going to just put a poem up here which asks us about I'll let you read it. It asks us, what is it, for me, this asks us, what is it that contributes to injustice, or that violence of a stream that actually looks really innocent and looks really passive, but absolutely is not. Because our job, I think, is just to name what those things are, the riverbed in Ashley's life and in others' lives that no one is speaking about. And our role is to be calling that out. The administrative and access to justice failures ran through Ashley's whole tragically short life. She was adopted. It was a closed adoption. So she had no way of knowing, and her family had no way of knowing about any mental health history of her biological family. No early warning signs could have been spotted. No interventions were offered earlier to help and to be more effective. She was an anonymous donor conceived, again, so her right to identity in CRC Article 8, there was no access to knowing about her history. She lived in a rural province, so there were poor access to services. There were no mental health services, and the responses to her behavior the response was to her behavior and not to her mental health, which I know is a common theme, and we heard that from Hannah as well. She eventually was transferred 1,000 miles away for what started as really petty crimes. She threw a crab apple at postal workers. And the rules she broke within the institutions is what kept her in the institutions. So what does this say about our dimensions of justice and the width of justice? I think these early experiences are increasingly being recognized around the world as being really part of that riverbed that we don't name, but needs to be named. And I think I'd like to share with you this video that demonstrates, it's just a short minute and a half, 2-minute video that demonstrates the growing global understanding. And I'm going to try and make this work. Let's see. You let me know if you can't hear that sound. I'm going to finish up here by thinking together with you, if I may, about the distance yet to travel and the hope. So, like Anthony, I don't even know that advert you were talking about, Anthony, but we're gonna end on something a little bit more hopeful. The first is to say that, of course, there's a really long distance to travel, and there's lots to be done. I think we know that. I think it varies from country to country, but we certainly are not complacent here or anywhere. I want to say, I think in Scotland, we're living in an incredible moment. And perhaps because I've spent the last 14 months during the pandemic, not in Scotland and in many countries via Zoom around the world, I'm all the more struck by this moment we have, that we are not complacent. We take nothing for granted, but this is a really important moment. And I say that because, what I've shared with you here is a call to action related to the Justice for Children project within the Pathfinders for Justice, which is a project I'm leading. We have a call to action. I want to just draw your attention to numbers 8, 9, and 10, which is about the foundations for change, which is why I have such hope. And these are captured in the next slide as well. So let's finish up with some hope. First of all, Hannah gives me hope. Hannah devastated me, but she gives me hope because she's speaking about this and because she is going into social care. And I think for all of us, we recognize the importance of people who have experienced the worst, but perhaps for some children also the best of what we can offer, to ensure that they are acting as agents of change, not to take away our responsibility, not to abdicate our responsibility as leaders and as those who are working on in the system, because we're responsible and we need to be. But I take great hope in the increasing numbers of children and the increasing ways in which participation has been a powerful way of bringing about change, from the Me Too movement to Greta Thunberg and the environment, to the care review close to home. Do you know, these are incredible things. It's incredible change when, and this change is disruptive. It's disrupting the status quo. So there's something for us in that, children increasingly being agents of change for us, which is about making sure that we're making room for that. Then not just in the public spaces, but in the day-to-day engagement. Every time we are making room for that voice of experience amongst our colleagues, as the normal. You know, this is something that I think in my career, I hope I finish my career eventually at where that is just normal and we're not even commenting on it anymore. The second thing about the CRC, and Bruce, I'm seeing at the time, so I'll wrap up with this. The second thing, just to really name, I want to be really explicit about this. Do you know the CRC is the first legally incorporated human rights instrument in Scotland that is encompassing not only civil and political rights, but economic, social, and cultural rights? It's a massive, incredible document. We heard from Jules about its potential. I just don't want us to even be limited in any way. This is how we get, the CRC is how we get to those social and economic determinants that are so important for us to get to. On the right-hand side up here, we know information, we know about how to close implementation gaps. We just need to put it into practice. There is a rhetoric of valuing prevention. It's just rhetoric, because actually at the moment in Scotland, there's loads still to be done. Ourselves on the back, but we've got politicians saying it's important, and I have to say that's incredible compared to a lot of the world. We have great people working in youth justice in Scotland, and in wider systems. And I think if there's anything that we've seen in the context of COVID, we've seen many different ways of working. Where there's been, the global response to children in detention. We can take big leaps when we have to. And it will take broader collaborations and new actors to bring into the mix, and evidence that speaks to these new agendas so that we win the arguments that we didn't win before COVID. And so finally, we've looked at this, the construction. That's my hope, I think, is the construction and the tools we have to make sure we can create the pathways that we want to get to. And that we use the tools and the opportunities we have in Scotland and the international standards as leverage in our advocacy to do all we can to ensure that every child in Scotland enjoys the full range of their rights, starting with the furthest behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davidson. That was a fantastic presentation. And I think that the depth of that is something that we can spend a lot of time over the next afternoon and tomorrow discussing. And I think that the important point that you make, that this international work is meaningful because it has meaning for children on the ground in Scotland and flows through everything that we do, and the incredible work that's been done in our growing understanding of children's experience as they get older, and that the issues that we fail to properly support them ending up with engagement with the justice system. And so I think that the pathway work is absolutely incredible. So thank you so much.